Well, good afternoon and welcome to another edition of the Texas Public Policy Foundation's weekly broadcast. Since the beginning of COVID tide, 20 or 30 years ago, actually just several months ago, we started doing these on Mondays, trying to get into your living room, your offices on your lunch hour and give you a sense of what's going on in America. And it is great that today we have one of the best members of the United States Senate. And I say that living in Texas, having two great members in Senator Cornyn and Senator Cruz. If we haven't met, I'm Kevin Roberts, Executive Director of the Texas Public Policy Foundation. What a treat to have with us today one of the senators from the great state of Tennessee, Senator Marsha Blackburn. It was just a few weeks ago that the senator and I bumped into one another, almost literally. We were visiting at different times with a mutual friend, a fellow Tennessean to Senator Blackburn, Alice Johnson, great conservative woman, just as Senator Blackburn is. And we realized, or at least I realized for the first time, that Senator Blackburn had written a book. And having just skimmed this recently, The Mind of a Conservative Woman, I can tell you that if you have not encountered this book, and I mean this seriously, go buy a copy. A lot of us have read a lot of books by elected officials, and I'll just say they're all good. This one, however, is particularly good because of its depth. So whether you're a conservative woman, a conservative man, or maybe you don't even see yourself as a conservative, I would encourage you to read this book because it will give you a sense of the optimism we all have as Americans. So what we're going to do today is have a conversation about what led to Senator Blackburn writing the book, what her motivations are as an elected official that's relevant to all of us, whether we're conservative or not, whether we're men or women. And I think most of all, by the end of the conversation today, we're going to leave this hour being a lot more optimistic in spite of everything that's happened in 2020. So to our good friend, Senator Marsha Blackburn, thank you so much, ma'am, for giving us some time today to talk about your book.
I am absolutely delighted to be a part of your broadcast today and to join you all. So thank you so much for that. And thank you for the hopeful optimism that I think we conservatives have. And now is certainly a good time for it.
Well, it is. And, Senator, before we jump into the book, just a couple of related but different questions. Some of our audience may not know that of all of the people who worked with the Texas Public Policy Foundation on criminal justice reform, you were one of the early leaders along with Texas Governor Rick Perry. And you are someone who, of course, is always happy for other people to receive the credit. But sort of like Texans in the 1830s, Texans in the early 2000s needed some great Tennesseans like yourself to help us with that. And on behalf of all of our staff here, everyone who worked on the First Step Act, your fellow Tennesseans, Alice Johnson, Matthew Charles, Julie Warren, our TPPF colleague who's in Tennessee, thank you for your leadership on that issue and others.
Delighted to do it. It was the right thing to do. And I give the credit to President Trump for making certain that he followed through on this. He made it a priority. And because of this, with the federal First Step Act, there are so many states, Tennessee included, that have stepped forward and that are beginning to look at reassessments, beginning to look at rehabilitation and moving people to fruitful and productive lives.
Well, and I think that framing was so important to getting people right of center and left of center on the issue. And in a lot of ways, that's kind of the theme of your book, which we'll get to just momentarily. But I would be remiss, Senator, if on behalf of everyone tuning in, I didn't ask such a respected member of the United States Senate what she thinks about what's going on with the election today, what you think the outcome may end up being. What sort of insight can you offer us from the bird's eye view that you have?
Yeah, I will tell you, in my opinion, what we see happening right now has been bubbling under the surface for quite a period of time, if you will. People would hear about different areas of the country where there would be a problem with ballots or with voting, things of that nature. And through this presidential election specifically, it seems to have kind of bubbled to the surface. So The problems exist in different buckets, if you will. You've got the problem with the mail-out ballots, where you have some states and some counties that chose to mail them out like they were a Publishers Clearinghouse sweepstakes notice. Everybody got one, whether they wanted it or not. Fill it out, send it in if you want to participate. And that is not what our founders intended when they said one person, one vote. You also have a problem with the ballot harvesting. I've talked to people that got multiple ballots at their home for previous residences. I talked to someone in one of these blue areas this last weekend. They had gotten a ballot for the individual who had lived in their home and died 12 years ago. And this family has been in this home for 11 years. And the deceased individual received a ballot. So all of these irregularities need to be reviewed, and anyone who knows of irregularities or knows of disenfranchisement, people who went to the polls to vote were told they had already voted, they need to be reporting that to donaldtrump.com. And they're cataloging these irregularities. So that harvesting is a problem. Then you have a problem with how votes were counted or audited. This is where the issues with the Dominion software come into play. Then you're going to have those components litigated. There are individuals, there is the Trump campaign, they have filed lawsuits, but at the end of the day, you're going to see responsibility bounce back to these state legislatures, who are going to turn around and say to these state and local election officials, no, you can't do this. You're going to have to depend on us to set the law. I think the way the Pennsylvania Secretary of State stepped in and changed she just said, we're going to change the law. And she just did it. This is the kind of thing that needs to be stopped.
Well, it does. And thank you for that comment. As I've told a lot of people over the last couple of weeks, it shouldn't matter if someone's liberal or conservative. We all ought to care deeply about election integrity. And I'm hopeful that whenever it is the dust settles from this election and we get into 2021, that all of us, Republican, Democrat, liberal, conservative, everyone in between, actually spends some time not just investigating the examples that you mentioned and others, but that we actually can reach a consensus as a country to do something about it. Because no elected official, regardless of their party, regardless of whatever philosophical differences we may have with him or her, ought to have to go into an election worrying about fraud costing them that election, especially in the United States.
That's right. You're precisely correct on that.
Well, we look forward, and since we are a policy shop after all, and working on that with you and others, but of course, we're here today to talk about something that's a whole lot of fun, and that's your book. And it's a whole lot of fun because in a lot of ways, the way I might summarize it, Senator, is it's a quintessential American story. You are in Tennessee now, of course, you represent that wonderful state. You grew up in Laurel, Mississippi. You'll have the opportunity for our audience to explain those prescient moments of your childhood and early adulthood that were very formative for you. But I thought what might be helpful for our audience, as I ask you the question, what spurred you to write this book now, is to frame that question with the end paragraph of the foreword by former Speaker Newt Gingrich, someone I'm sure many of our audience members respect. Speaker Gingrich writes, Senator Blackburn is a major force in the Senate and in America. She's also an inspiration to young women who would like to go into public service. This book, The Mind of a Conservative Woman, is a good place for them to start. It gives them a chance to get to know someone who is going to be playing an ever bigger role in America's future. A big praise from someone who's a real icon for the conservative movement. Senator, I'm just curious, you're a busy gal. You have a lot of responsibilities. What was it that motivated you to sit down and write this book?
It is one of those things that kind of happens along the pathway. And yes, I do appreciate Speaker Gingrich, who's been a wonderful mentor to me. in writing the foreword for the book. As I would be traveling the country and speaking to women's groups or maybe women's business groups, I would hear from people who would say, you know, Marsha, the media has such a double standard and they treat conservative women terribly. And this was coming from women who were not only in elective office, but maybe they were volunteers or they were in a corporate setting. And they just felt like they were continued to be ridiculed and mocked and diminished and pushed aside because they would not submit to the agenda of the left. And they felt that there was kind of a subcurrent out there that free thinking, independent women really not try to move up that corporate ladder or move up that political ladder because they were not going to toe the line for what the liberals think women should be about. Most women will tell you the economy, safety, security, I call them the security moms, that's their number one issue. But the left, they want to say, no, it's about government control. It's about reproductive rights. It's about the story of Julia and having the government plot all of your steps. So these are just such different views. So I decided it was time to work on this. And I wrote a book called Life Equity a few years ago. And the literary agent on that was talking with me one day, and she said, it's time for you to write another book. If you wrote it, what would you write it about? I said, I would write it about the way conservative women are just what our country needs and the way the left treats conservative women and how they're threatened by conservative women. And I have to tell you, as I wrote this book in 2019, and as Hachette, who was the publisher, pulled the book forward, and they gave it the publish date of September 1st, and instead of during the summer, little did we know that Amy Coney Barrett was going to be nominated for the US Supreme Court. And here you would see the living embodiment of the mind of a conservative woman and the differences that are there. And little did we know that 2020 would turn out to be the year of the conservative woman in national politics. And as I worked with so many of these women around the country that were running for the US House, and you all had a wonderful woman in Texas who is coming to the US House. Little did we know this was going to be the year, but you're exactly right. What we've written about in the book, what we have worked with these women who have won these races, this really is what is all about. And Speaker Gingrich is right. Women that are out there in the corporate life, women that are wanting to get into a public service of some type, the first step should be to read The Mind of a Conservative Woman so they know what they're going to be up against and they know how to fight back.
Well, it's so true. And I think that any of us guys who are listening to what you just said can relate to that. I certainly can here at leading the largest public policy group outside DC with all these wonderful conservative women here. The difference between the way, and it's important, we understand men and women are complementary in every respect, but the genius of conservative women is that they can take what we guys might say with a certain edge, just because of how God made us, but with a certain amount of grace, a certain amount of persuasiveness. And I think that's why you saw so many of the new Republican, or I should say to be nonpartisan, conservative women coming into the US House who were able to win their races because of that. And so I'm going to read some of your words here for you precisely on this point, so our readers can get a sense of just the narrative momentum of this book. You write, the left can't believe that a female could actually choose not to be a member of the National Organization for Women, that they might be pro-life, or that they might stand for conservative and constitutional values. They can't believe that you don't need the federal government to lead you through life, holding your hand and providing for you cradle to grave. What a fantastic passage, Senator.
Well, and it's just so true. What is really so astounding, and I actually talked about this when I closed the argument for the Republican side of the dais with the Judge Barrett confirmation. I said, it is at times distressing to people to see how the left will choose and be satisfied with intellectual isolation, as opposed to choosing or allowing viewpoint diversity. They're so narrow-minded that they say, if you don't buy hook, line, and sinker, what we're telling you you need to do, then don't even apply. You can't get in the clique, you can't get in the club. But you have to abide by what we say. That is intellectual isolationism. And we see this playing out on our college campuses. It has led to the cancel culture. But the left is so challenged, they make their point, and that is the end of the discussion. They don't want the counterpoint. They don't want to hear that there might be a better way to do something, that there might be a better approach. What they do is just shut it down. As my dad would have said, it's their way or the highway. And they're not going to give you any running room at all. And basically, to women who are pro-life, pro-business, pro-military, pro-religion, and to Judge Barrett, a mom of 7 kids who takes her children to church every week, they said, you're not one of us. Now, that's a sad state of affairs when in this nation, you cannot exercise being pro-life over the entire spectrum, or pro-religion, and actively practicing and living out your faith, pro-military for a strong defense to protect our country, pro-business to be productive and innovate and provide for our families and for others. But no, government dependence, adherence to the leftist agenda is what is paramount to them.
That's right. It's basically amounts to intellectual tyranny and is the exact opposite of freedom. Like we like to say here when we're doing events with mixed audiences, people of all ideological stripes are welcome to be in our audience, of course, just like when you're visiting people or campaigning. I always say civil discourse is not the unanimity of opinion. In fact, the unanimity of opinion might be the example of the exact opposite, right? Where someone's trying to tell you what to believe. And I think that one of the themes that you emphasize so well and poignantly throughout the book is precisely that. In fact, I'm reminded, and you mentioned this a moment ago, of the example you cite of the Obama administration's little video about the life of Julia, which, to sum up, basically provides no room for church or family, or as you put it, no community. And I think one of the things we might learn from reading your book, from really getting into the intellectual depths of conservatism, is that when we talk about government problems, we're not merely just talking about the expense. We're not just merely talking about budget deficits. What you're saying and what so many of us who are conservatives are saying is that government is crowding out community relationships that we have a moral obligation to attend to. And so I think that with all of the conservative women coming into Congress, you use the example of our newest Supreme Court justice, perhaps there will be a greater emphasis by us as conservatives to talk about the importance of building community. I think that will be something that is timely over the next several years.
I think you're going to see that because this election cycle, and you saw this play out in the elections for the House and the Senate, with women, one of the top issues was safety and security of their communities and their families. Second was economic security for their families and their communities. And the third thing was school choice, so that they have the opportunity to read into their children's lives. And it's not the government making those decisions for them, that families are going to be making those decisions for themselves.
That's so crucial. So, Senator, as you know, the people who ask the smartest questions in this broadcast are our audience. And so in a few moments, we're going to turn to them, but I'll just cue you if you're in the audience, you have a question, just go into the comment section of the social media channel you're using and type in your question. It will come to me. But a couple of questions before we do that, Senator. You do an excellent job in this book, as you mentioned earlier, in discussing the history of conservative thought. And I want to get to a specific writer you mentioned in just a moment. But what I love about your book, and maybe I can relate to it as a fellow Southerner, is that while those academic things are really good because they help us to understand why we're conservative, conservatism starts in our homes, at our dinner tables, in our communities. And you write very poignantly the following: conservatism was woven into the everyday world that made me. From the soil of my youth and the dinner table conversations I knew as a child, from the example of parents and the warm values of a loving Southern community, I came naturally to what I believe today and to what I hold most dear. I think that really explains for many people who see themselves as conservatives what it is, what this mode of thought is before we even think about writers who've influenced us.
Well, you're right about that. And my mother used to say that actions were worth 1,000 words. Not a picture, but an action. Knowing what somebody was going to do and seeing it lived out, not necessarily what somebody would say. And whether it was our church or school or the 4-H club or the Farm Bureau meeting, I saw my parents act the same way. Then, when we sat down at the dinner table, they would talk about what we as a family believed, and they would live that out. We would see that lived out. And if someone had a trying time or a mistake in their life, we would talk about what we hoped they would learn from that. Likewise, as children, we were taught, and I've taught my children, there's no such thing as a failed test. It matters what you learned from that and how you're going to apply that in your life going forward, and use that to benefit not only yourself, but other people. So this is that building that sense of community, and thereby that shared responsibility and accountability to those people that are sharing your daily life.
Well, that's well said. And just an observation, you got a great chapter about your 5-word mission: faith, family, freedom, hope, and opportunity. That's what I'm thinking about when I talk about how optimistic your book is. And so the final question I'll ask you, Senator Blackburn, before we turn to audience questions, is about that history, that academic background of conservatism. And I was just thrilled to see that the conservative writer you leaned on heavily is someone we do here at the foundation. We do this program called the Philosophy of Freedom for interns and junior staff. And it's based heavily on the writings of the conservative scholar Russell Kirk, whom a lot of movement conservatives aren't all that familiar with. And I'm just curious if you might give our audience a quick lesson in Russell Kirk and why he's so important to what we believe as conservatives today.
Yes, one of the things I appreciate about the writings from Russell Kirk is that he goes back to the genesis of how we got where we are. And I take his 5 cities approach, if you will, and use that to help build out where we are. Federalism is something we get from the 12 tribes of Israel. And if you go in and read the Old Testament, you see this. They were responsible, each tribe unto themselves. but they were also responsible to the nation of Israel. Then you look at Jerusalem, where we get our Judeo-Christian ethic. You look at philosophy that comes from the Greeks and law from the Romans, and our structure of government that comes out of London and Parliament, and Philadelphia for our founding documents, and how we put those documents to work in our nation's capital. But understanding the foundation, what we are made of, and this heritage. And Russell Kirk, if you read his writings, you see that he brings this from the nexus forward into where we are today. Of course, I think William F. Buckley picked up some of that. Reagan picked up a lot of that and put it into layman's language. So weaving all of these together helps us to understand we didn't just invent conservatism, and it isn't something that fell out of the sky with the 21st century. This is something that goes back to when you had the 12 tribes of Israel. This is what we call first principles. And it is what we as conservatives stand on. And I have to tell you, as I was deciding to write the book, I had mentioned to someone, I said, you know, one of the things that interests me, I speak to a lot of women's business groups around the country. And invariably, inevitably, in every single question and answer, someone will throw up their hand and they will say, you know, Marsha, I'm not a Democrat or a Republican. I'm an independent. I look at the issues. I look at the candidates, then I make my mind up. So after a few years of hearing that, I said, you know, tell me about your filter. What do you look for when you're looking at an issue or looking at a candidate? Well, I believe in the Constitution, is what they would say. I believe in equal treatment under the law. I believe in equal justice for all. I think everybody should have equal opportunity. I don't want government micromanaging my life. I don't want them making my healthcare decisions. I don't want them deciding what my child is going to be educated on. I want to make those. I think government creates the environment for jobs growth to take place. And you know what? After hearing this a few dozen times, I thought most women are in the center or center right. But from all of the media that they're listening to, they're being told they need to be on the left because the left is the leader on women's issues. But women's issues focus on faith, family, freedom, hope, and opportunity for their family.
Well, and the testament to that, as we've now gotten enough distance from Election Day to be able to do some analysis, is that whether they were conservative men or conservative women, when the conservative candidate, I'm thinking especially for the US House, but also some of your Senate colleagues, talked in those terms about faith, family, hope, freedom, opportunity, they won. And I think that's the lesson for us, that's got to be the narrative framing for us. Having limited government, having specific policy outcomes, of course, those are crucial, but they're not the overarching framing that's most persuasive. And frankly, not just to women, but also to a lot of men. So
well, you're precise. You're very precisely correct on that. I have told our leadership at the Republican National Committee that we need to rebrand GOP. And it ought not to be grand old party. It should be the Great Opportunity Party, because we believe in freedom, free enterprise, free markets. We believe in opportunity for all people.
Well, that's well said. And what I love about that as a historian of the United States and its politics is that it goes straight to the origins of the Republican Party in the mid 1850s, which was a working class, free labor party. It's exactly what the party was founded on. So you get my approval for what it's worth on that. A plus from this history professor. So that aside, much more importantly, we have several questions that have come in from our audience. The first one, Senator Blackburn, is what advice would the senator have for conservative women who are thinking about running for office?
Well, as we have said, read the book. It's a great way. It's a great way to get going. I think what you have to do is make certain that you can articulate what you believe and why. That is why in the book I put the history of conservatism. I also have a reading list in the book that I would recommend you get these books and put them on your Kindle or on your nightstand and begin to read those. And I also have a section in there, how to win the arguments, because how to ask the questions, how to have these discussions on issues that many times the media is never going to frame it appropriately for us, such as the issue of life. You know, people will say, well, you know, why would you take this choice away from women? Well, let's think about this another way. Why do you think we should have a government policy that causes the loss of 1,700 lives per day in the United States? So thinking about that framing is something that's important. So to conservative women, I would say your country needs you. Look at through history, and I talk a little bit about our noble heritage of conservative women, also going back in the Old Testament, looking at Deborah and Esther and Huldah, looking at some of our nation's freedom fighters, and Abigail Adams, who told her husband, remember the ladies, the suffragists who 100 years ago, we've just celebrated 100 years of women's suffrage, who fought for 72 years to receive the right to vote. Look at how they fought, but know your history and apply it to today and be willing to fight. You know, I say, I was talking with someone that had won last week. It was someone that had fought hard. And this guy said, well, you know, you ladies are pretty tough. I said, no, we are mocked and ridiculed so much that we know what we're made of. And we stand on our principles, and we know better than to give in or to give up.
Well said. So, Senator, you may have set the record for audience questions for one of these broadcasts. So there's no way we're going to get through all of these. So now I get the really difficult job of figuring which of these to pass along to you. I think a perfect next question, given your statement just a moment ago from this audience member is, can you name the biggest difficulty you've come across as a conservative woman and how you overcame that?
Yes, the biggest difficulty that you have as a conservative female is putting up with individuals, many times men who do not exercise the same respect or collegiality with women that they do with men. And as I will say many times, we need to get over people saying, why is she here? And saying, we are so glad you are here. Because women have a very circuitous route in their careers. It gives them a broader perspective than men who get on a career track and just take off and go. Women take time off for children, for caring for elderly relatives. They have a good, diverse viewpoint, and it's important for that to be in the discussion of public policy and to hear that viewpoint, and making certain that men realize we add to the strength, we do not detract.
Well, that's well said. Another question along those lines. We're told that it's not possible to be a good mother and be career or politically oriented. What has your experience been with this?
Well, I have 2 children and 3 grandchildren, and I have learned how to be an expert at time management and appreciate that I have that opportunity. I I have to tell you, I laughed out loud when one of these leftist journalists said that Amy Barrett didn't have time to be a Supreme Court justice because she had 7 children. Now, that journalist is not God. God is going to give us what we need to handle the challenges of our days. He is also going to open doors for us that we may never have imagined would be open to us. And God uses non-traditional leaders, has done it more than once to save his nation.
Yes, that's well said. So also along the same lines, a great conversation thread for our audience. How can conservative men be better allies to conservative women?
They need to listen. And I appreciate so much some of the male mentors that have been a part of my career and a part of my life. And having them listen is vitally important in realizing what they can learn from us. Periodically, if I think that, and I did this before I came into the political world, in my business life, and as I had my marketing company, I would from time to time remind people that the hand that rocks the cradle rules the world. And women are, if you're talking about product marketing and placement, it is women who are the primary purchasers for their households. When it comes to healthcare, 80% of all healthcare decisions are made by women. Research shows that in 2015, cars were purchased more often by a female than a male. And so it is time, even in the political world, women know how to solve problems, and they should be appreciated for the viewpoint that they bring to the table.
Well, I love that. And I think particularly for those of us who spend a lot of time thinking about not just policies, but how to persuade other people of how those policies are the right way to go.
Yeah,
We know as conservatives that we have all the logic, all the facts, all the data. What we fail to do often is actually attach a human face to that, to tell a story about that. And I have found as a conservative man that conservative women who are in politics just do that naturally because of the nature of women. And I think more of that can serve us all a lot better. So
exactly.
flip side, and then we'll switch gears a little bit and move toward wrapping up, Senator.
Yeah.
What would you like to see more of in conservative women? So we know what men can do a better job of. Maybe you have become a mentor for other conservative women in politics.
Yes.
What would you like to see there?
You know, I think that as conservative women began to push through and get elected to office and serve and elevate their platform, being bold and not backing down. And I was talking to someone who was going to run for an office, and he said, "Well, I'm the next guy in line. I deserve this." And I said, "You know what? The next guy in line might actually be a woman. And that's why you're going to see a woman step forward because they've earned this." My grandmother, and I wrote about this in Life Equity when I wrote that book, she would use a phrase. My grandmother was quite a trailblazer and had such an impact on my life, and went to college when women didn't really go to college. Took agriculture classes when women weren't allowed to take agriculture classes. And when I would achieve something and I wouldn't want to say anything about it because I didn't want anybody to say I was bragging or boasting. And my grandmother would say, "It's not bragging if you've done it." And she would say, "You have to learn how to talk about things that you've accomplished so that people realize that you have accomplished this. If you cannot tell your story, nobody else is going to tell your story." And we hear this in politics all the time. Define yourself before your opponent defines you. Find a way to talk about what you have done and to communicate that to people. So, Nana Morgan's advice would be, it's not bragging if you've done it. So find that way to talk about it.
Oh, it's important. I think that's where being cheerful about it allows us to say things like that as well. And also
Right.
looking for opportunities to give other people credit to collaborate, which might be the lesson for those of us in the conservative movement this year. Well, look, Senator, I would sit here and talk with you all day, but I know you've got a lot to do. I can't thank you enough for your time. The last question I'll ask is one that I ask most of our guests. And it's framed this way. 2020 has been challenging between COVID, the shutdowns, some of which are no doubt questionable, a very trying election aftermath. In spite of all of that, many of us wake up each day and we're still optimists. And I know that our audience members always love hearing from our guests, especially those of you who are in elected office, reasons for your hopefulness about the future of America. What would you say?
Oh, and I am hopeful. We stand on the Constitution. We stand on the Bill of Rights. We stand on these first principles that I mentioned earlier. And as difficult as the left made every single day for President Donald Trump, look at what he did for this country. I think when you look at the results from the local and state elections that took place in November, when you look at the initiatives that were rejected, the liberal leaning initiatives that were rejected, when you look at the balance of power in the House, in the Senate, that what you see is that this nation is beginning to move away from some of these leftist socialist policies and to reposition itself. People realize freedom is a very precious commodity. I do think another thing that makes me hopeful is knowing that there are conservative women who are looking at the fact that Congress can't seem to get things done. Different groups have gone to their corners and they're not wanting to talk about things. Women are saying, my children and their future and the future for their friends is more valuable than this. You people need to get over yourselves and get the job done. So I hope that all of your viewers will stay in touch with me. They'll find me on social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, Parler. It is at Marsha Says, MarshaSays. Let's stay in touch and let's have more conservatives raise their hand and say, I'm willing to serve and to get this country back on track.
Oh, amen, Senator. Thanks so much for that
Thank
comment. You bet, for the time you've spent with us today. Most of all, for your service in the United States Senate. I think any of you and our wonderful audience who's tuned in may be a little down in the dumps about something with the election or the challenges of this year. I'm hopeful that the Senator has provided you some optimism about why it's great to be an American. One last plug for her book, The Mind of a Conservative Woman. You can find, I'm sure, at all of your regular places to buy books. If you're looking about how to win an argument, books to read as a conservative or someone who's flirting with being a conservative, this book should be your first stop. We always like to end this broadcast by thanking you. In fact, I think it's possible to be a conservative by first working in gratitude, being grateful for what we have inherited. And so thank you, Senator Blackburn, one last time for reminding us of that, and for all of you in the audience for being part of this. May God bless you, may He prosper the work of your hands, and may He continue